I'm pleased to be part of the Design Practice Speaker Series. Today's topic is Agile Practices. And where this comes about, of course, is Agile is a set of development and project management practices that have completely revolutionized the way software is developed today. Software did not used to be developed this way. Software originally was developed in ways that are more similar to the way almost everything else is developed, in a more staged and planned and programmed fashion. Agile has revolutionized software development over the last 30 years to the point where it really works differently. So what I want to do today is to talk about why is that? Why exactly is software developed differently? And more importantly, what are some specific practices that are in software development that we can use outside of software? Some of these methods or practices are relatively easy to adopt and use outside of software, and others are going to be harder. And so it's really kind of, so these 10 practices are in some sense a menu or a set of selections that can be used in different contexts. And some contexts could use most or all of them quite readily. So I want to start with, see how I click my slide. Okay, I want to start with where did this come from? So what developed Agile software development as a set of practices? And I think it stems from three things, and these are probably three things that you're aware of. So one is an alternative to a planned or staged development process called the spiral development process. The second is a group of software engineers who got together and wrote down what they call the Agile Manifesto, which is really about what are the values that we think should drive the way we manage our projects that are different from the traditional project management values. And third is the whole kind of continuous improvement realm of Six Sigma. And these have come together into what is today modern Agile software development. I'll cover some of these bases along the way. So if you're not familiar with all of these particular terms, you'll get the picture along the way. But I want to be really clear. What are the 10 ideas I want to talk about? So these are 10 ideas that are practices of Agile that are worth understanding, using, sharing, incorporating into your development process. So they are the spiral development, which I've already mentioned is one of the roots. Putting those spirals into what we call sprints that are time boxed, that is planned for certain periods of time. Working together using a number of practices that go together called Scrum, one of which is having a team. The second of which is having a daily meeting of that team to share status updates. The third element of Scrum that I want to focus on is separating a person in charge of what the job is to be done, which is called a product owner, from a person who's in charge of how we run our process, and that's called a Scrum Master. The sixth element is making the control of work visual through some kind of Kanban board or program board or list. And the seventh one is about prioritizing the features or the work or the tasks or the stories or whatever the elements of work might be, and putting those prioritized elements in a list typically called a backlog, and making those visually available on the program board. The seventh one is called DevOps, and that's kind of like design for manufacturing, but for software. So it's essentially merging development and operations teams together so they can merge their processes. The ninth practice around Agile I want to touch on today is coaching. And that is to have some process experts help the teams implement Agile better and better every time. And then finally, when the challenge is larger than any one team can accomplish, and we need to have multiple teams, they need to interact. So multiple interacting teams need a larger scale of planning and coordination. And so there are some ways that Agile has been scaled up. So these are the 10 practices that I'd like to cover today. And I'll spend a few minutes on each one, actually, talking about each one and giving you some ideas of how they can be adapted to other contexts around software. So I'm not really going to talk about software development today. I'm going to talk about how these practices can be used in projects in general, primarily outside of software. Okay, so I want to start with the Agile Manifesto because when you look at this, you'll see that these are 10 things that are all important. And the key thing in the Agile, I'm sorry, 8 things are all important. But the key thing in the manifesto is to say that these on the left are more important than these on the right. So for example, we value individuals and interactions. That's important for getting our work done. And that's more important than using all the processes and tools correctly. So it's not that processes aren't important. It's that how we work together is more important. We value getting things working right, working software, over having more detailed documentation. So sure, documentation is necessary. We know that. But even more importantly, we value working software. We value collaborating with our customers to get the product right, over negotiating a contract to agree on the details up front. We value responding to change instead of simply following a plan. The plan has to change. So it's not that the plan is not important, but responding to change in the plan is more important. And so you can, if you read this, it's kind of like Agile is kind of an anti-planning, anti-control approach. And when you think about it, that's pretty different from our traditional way of managing development projects, which have a lot of planning and control involved. So a traditional project management approach is what's known in most industries as a staged development process. It's sometimes called a phase gate or a toll gate or a stage gate. There's lots of different words for these. But the idea is that we plan and we expect to run through the process in this sort of what's in software called a waterfall fashion. We do planning and we get that right, we review it, we do concept development. We get that right, we review it, we do system level design, detail design, integration, and so forth. And the idea is that we plan this up front. We may plan the timing. We may plan the kind of level of effort in each stage or phase. We may plan expected review dates. And the expectation is that we'll iterate inside the phases, but we won't iterate across the phases. So the red arrows that go backwards and back up to previous phases, those are mistakes. Those are not expected. Those unplanned iterations are not, we do our best to avoid them by getting the work right within each phase. So I start with this to contrast what a spiral process looks like. Now, a spiral development process, so this is practice number 1 that's worth understanding and applying. A spiral development process says, well, no matter what we do, we've got to execute all those same activities. We still have to go through that fundamental set of work: planning, concept, system level design, and so forth. But the plan is going to be that we'll execute each one multiple times. So we don't do planning just once. We'll plan every spiral or iteration as we go through it. We'll revisit the concept. Now, we may not change it much. We may just work on the concept of one chunk of it. And so the idea is as the heavy line snakes through each of these shaded regions, that means we're executing that activity. So one of the things that this lays out is, okay, we're executing each fundamental activity multiple times. We're starting out by maybe doing more planning, and we're ending up by doing more testing. So we don't necessarily do everything every time. We may not even do a review at the end of each spiral. Let me show you one example of a spiral development process. So this comes from Microsoft, and the idea is it involves 4 overall phases: planning, development, stabilization, release. Early on, it's a different version of a spiral diagram. It's sometimes called an anaconda chart, but the idea is that the red line, as it snakes through each of these regions, that means we're executing the activity in the bar. So we do planning, we have a review up front, we do development in 3 huge chunks or spiral rounds. And the idea is that we'll split up all the features and functions into 3 bins or buckets or groups. And the first group is expected to be completed at the first review. The first group of features would be the most important features. And so the expectation is that in the first spiral round of coding, integrating, testing, debugging, we'll have executed 1/3 of all the features and functions, and it's the most important ones. They get to that soft review, and they might find that they haven't completed them all. A soft review is a review that we pass through even if everything's not done. And so in the second spiral round, they'll execute the remaining high priority features plus all the medium priority features, or as many as they can. They'll do the coding, integrating, debugging, and so forth. They get to the second soft review, same thing happens. They push into the third phase of spiral all the features that hadn't yet been completed. They do the same in the third phase. When it comes to the third review, which I've labeled the hard review, what happens is they haven't completed everything. What happens at a hard review is if it's not finished, it won't be in the product. So they enter stabilization phase, which means we're just fixing things, but we're not coding new features. So they'll go through a bunch of debugging through stabilization phase, and then it's time for maybe a review for beta, and then they find some more bugs after a beta release, and then a final product release. So this is a spiral development process, and for those of you familiar with staged process, it's clear how this is very, very different. So that's the development practice number one that's worth looking at. I'm going to put together 2, 3, 4, and 5 into what's called the Scrum development process, because each of these is an element of the Scrum process. So Scrum is essentially Agile at the team level. And so the other processes I'm going to layer onto it are essentially beyond and outside of a team. But the Scrum development process specifies the practice of development for a team. And it involves a number of key elements that we're going to put in here. The first one is what's called the time-boxed sprint. So the idea is that each spiral that's now in this case called a sprint is pretty short. It's just a couple of weeks. I've seen some 1 week, some 3 or 4 weeks. So, it's a very short time-boxed sprint. Time-boxed means it's always 2 weeks. Whatever our period is, it's always going to be that. And that cycle always has the same set of activities. It starts with sprint planning. It does the work in the sprint through a daily process that we'll talk about. It ends with demonstration and review of what we've done and a retrospective of how the processes work. So each cycle has the same kind of set of activities. The second key thing is who's executing this. The Scrum team is essentially the group of people who can execute that. And on the team includes 2 specific roles. One role on the team is called the Scrum Master, and the Scrum Master's job is to help the team get its work done and to keep the team on track in terms of running the process correctly and make sure that we can do all these special events correctly and so forth. The product owner is in charge of what the team gets done. So they're in charge of connecting with customers, other stakeholders, and writing down what the needs, requirements, stories, all those kind of tasks to do as in what's called a product backlog. And most importantly, prioritizing the backlog so that the backlog would be a set of activities that we need to get done. And then in each sprint, that is each cycle, the team will choose the top items off the backlog, which is the most important things that have been prioritized. And they'll say, we think we can get this much of the backlog done in the next periodic sprint. Those items then go on to what's called a sprint backlog, which is what we think we can get done in this particular sprint cycle. And then the planning involves matching up who's going to do what, roughly when. Critical thing that happens within each the sprints is that every day the team has a really short meeting. It's maybe a 15-minute morning meeting where everybody checks in. So the idea of the daily meeting is we say everybody checks in and answers 3 questions. What did I get done yesterday? What am I going to work on today? And what help do I need? What impediments am I having? What's getting in my way of getting the work done? And so in this manner, everybody checks in and we can see what everybody's doing, and that helps us coordinate the work and understand the progress. And most importantly, the Scrum Master pays careful attention to this. And the Scrum Master's job is to make those impediments go away. So if somebody says, I need a customer to help me evaluate this, or I need to have this from this other team, or I need to have some help with this, the Scrum Master will take that on and help make that happen. So you'll notice that the product owner being in charge of the product backlog is specifying this is the work we need to get done. the Scrum Master is now in charge of how do we get the work done. So that separation of what from how I find to be a really compelling element of the Scrum development process. Just to finish up the process, the idea is at the end of each sprint, we have something that can be, in principle, delivered to customers. At least in software, they'll often talk about incremental delivery. At the end of every sprint, we have something that can be reviewed, it can be tested, and it can be maybe released to customers. Often outside the realm of software, we don't generally see incremental delivery at the end of every sprint. Importantly, the end of every sprint involves a demonstration to evaluate, have we completed these features or items on the backlog? We test them, and then we feed that back to the product owner who would perhaps update the backlog. We just talk a little bit about how this can be adapted outside of software. So how do we adapt Scrum if this is not a software development project? There are a number of ways to do it. So first of all, the product owner, many organizations use the role, what's called product manager, who has responsibility for success. And that person would neatly map into product owner. But we just give them the very specific task of making sure they manage the product backlog and maintain connection with customers and other things that are done typically as part of product management. Second, the product backlog is, so we always have a list of deliverables. This is now a prioritized list. So prioritization is really important so that we work on the most important things and to deliver the most value. Third, the project leader could become the Scrum Master. Often the project leader is the product manager, but here I'm asking us to think carefully about why we need to separate those roles. So a project leader can develop Scrum Master skills through Scrum Master training and practice. The sprint backlog is, if we're going to organize ourselves into periodic sprints, then we have to decide, not specifically how are we going to make progress in each sprint. And that might typically have a sprint goal and a backlog and backlog items selected from it. The team itself actually does a lot of self-organizing. So this mechanism of the daily meeting, the mechanism of the backlog, making it really clear what resources we have, what each one's doing, and what are the most important things to do next, allows the team to be largely self-organizing. The daily meeting as a regular check-in is probably the easiest of all these elements of Scrum to be implemented in teams outside of software. And then finally, having maybe not necessarily testing and release, but certainly having an evaluation. I think of it as a demo and review at the end of every sprint, and to have stakeholders involved in that. Customers, senior managers, other stakeholders would directly be involved in the evaluation. Okay, so Scrum is, I think of it as, this is half of Agile. It's what happens at the level of the teams. A couple of more critical elements of that, just to be really clear, having some kind of a visual control in what's sometimes called a program board or sometimes called a Kanban board. There are a number of ways to do that. I mean, here's a simple illustration that says, here's our backlog and which are the ones we're choosing to do in this sprint. And you can have them, and they might move through a certain set of stages. So being worked on, being tested, being completed, being accepted, things like that. I could show you some examples of this. I also want to point out the explicit prioritization. So the backlog is typically more detailed at the top, the most important things, so we know exactly what to do. The things that we're going to do later, you really don't need to detail them out because you may never get to them. So the product owner will typically be paying attention to sort of grooming and detailing the elements at the top of the backlog, and less so the later ones. I'll show you an example of a Kanban board. This is from an organization which actually has a number of different development teams and projects, which you see across the rows. And as they're executing each piece, they'll cross them off. And so these are features and tasks, and these are done in 1 month sprints. So you see January, February, March, and they'll do quarterly planning. So this is 3 months worth of work So they'll do quarterly planning, and then within each quarter they have 3 months and several things that they're planning to do within each one. I can show you another example. This is from one that's got, in this case, about 10 different teams. And this is in a little bit more of a scaled Agile context because these teams actually interface with each other. So the red strings tying the tasks together across. And so this is, again, planning for multiple sprints. So this is, you may not be able to read it, but 1, 2, 3, 4 sprints. The 4 slices are 4 little photos to make them come out a little bit better. I've been fascinated in looking at the structure of scaled Agile projects and looking at how the strings kind of connect the work of the task, because I look at structure of processes. So that's another researchy topic we could talk about another day. These are often implemented in software. So the Trello is one very easy to use method that teams can use to keep track of their backlogs and what's going on and with the different boards, lists, and task items. Take a few minutes to talk about DevOps. So I think I mentioned at the start that DevOps is essentially like what we learned through the 80s and 90s about design for manufacturing, that if you can put design teams and manufacturing teams together, they can merge their work. Software took a long time to figure this out as well. And over the last 10 years, I guess the story goes is that the dev teams and the op teams kind of hated each other, butted heads, threw work over the wall to each other back and forth. And some organizations have figured out, if we can merge those effectively, then we can almost continuously release into operations. And this has been particularly applied in cloud-based software. So think about services that we use where the software is running in the cloud, but the software is also being managed and operated essentially by those who also developed it. And what we're learning today is that this basic idea can be applied not just outside of cloud-based software environments, but even outside of software entirely. I'll show you one example. This is from Netflix, which is probably a service that many of you would know. And you just look at the numbers here. It's striking. Thousands of production changes. That is, little changes in how features or aspects of the systems are working every day. Thousands. And they're doing this with not thousands of engineers. They're doing with dozens of engineers, right? And the way they're able to do that is through DevOps. And so the idea is that there's this constant flow of engineering changes that are happening, and they're constantly being tested, evaluated on test machines, then operational hardware, and then eventually rolled out to millions and millions of users. Element up number 9 on my list of 10 Agile practices is process coaching. So Agile, as it's applied, like any maybe good structured development process, it is live in that it changes over time. And so at first, we try things out and we see how things work and we learn about how they work and what doesn't work and what we can do better. And what we've found, what I've noticed in every effective implementation of Agile is there are specific role for Agile coaches. And what the Agile coaches do is they help us run the process right. And they help us get better at running the process. So this chart comes from Spotify, which is got a bunch of interesting stuff out there about how they're running Agile specifically, which is a little different from some other organizations' implementation of Agile. But the role of the coaches is to kind of keep people engaged in Agile, that this is not just a job to do, but it's the way we get our work done. It's our culture. It's how we think and work and do things together. So coaching, I've seen in other organizations, coaching coaches, they'll coach the specific roles. They have coaches for product owners, so product owners know how to do their job and do it better. They have coaches for Scrum Masters. They have coaches for every major event that happens in the Agile process, to watch how it goes, observe it, and make suggestions of how to make it better. And finally, and this is where my own research is about, is how does Agile scale up to larger complex systems? Because my research looks at large and complex systems. So what I think of is the challenge is scaling it to multiple teams, essentially. And I'm not talking about, say, 10 teams that are working on 10 different products that have nothing to do with each other, but 10 teams that are working on the same product and that they have to interface together. So there have been 3 or 4 pretty well thought out ways to do this. So one of them is called SAFe, or Scaled Agile Framework. And this is a picture of SAFe from their training materials, which talks about Agile at 3 levels. So just going across, you see the lower level is team-based Agile. And if you look at the kind of the words that are in there at the team-based level, it's essentially everything I said about Scrum. So when I said Scrum is team-based Agile, even in Scaled Agile, teams still work that way. They have a Scrum Master, they have a product owner, they have those different roles, they have time-box sprints. The difference is that they plan their work for 5 sprints at a time. So Scaled Agile typically involves planning for multiple sprints. And SAFe, this particular framework for Scaled Agile, says we plan for 5 sprints at a time. So there are 4 normal sprints and 1 I&P sprint. They call the innovation and planning sprint. You see at the end after the 4 sprints. Okay, so they're scaling the planning for not just 1 sprint, but 4 or 5 at a time. The second thing they're doing is they're scaling the coordination. And the coordination, so if you think back to the program maps that I showed you a couple of slides ago with those red strings, the red strings are the planned coordination. And so we think about coordinating across teams because our subsystems or components or features or whatever have to work together. That can be partially planned in advance. We can anticipate certain interfaces, but they can't be fully. So some interactions between teams will also emerge. And so there has to be a way to handle the emergent needs. And actually, when you think about it, the emergent need could simply be brought up in a daily meeting. Somebody says to the teams, and including the Scrum Master, I need this from that other team. They're not giving it to me, or we didn't know we needed it in advance, or I just figured this out now. And that's okay. So that's an impediment. And who's going to handle that? So the Scrum Master is going to handle that. And maybe the product owner needs to get involved too, because they have to convince the other product owner to add work to the other team's list of work. And so the idea here is that we scale both planning and coordination so that the teams can get their work done and that they can integrate the work together. Let me just talk about now the 3 levels here in this diagram. So we've talked about team-based. Program-based, the program level is we're going to do something that's bigger than any one team. In fact, we're going to have a whole increment of the product release and offering that involves all these many teams actually coordinating together to get an increment in their functionality completed at the same time. And so the idea of what they call an Agile release train, this is a group of teams that are all kind of together in one sort of aspect of it. The terminology may be a little weird. I think of a release train as a train of releases, but that's not the way the terminology is used here. An ART, Agile Release Train, is a group of the teams. So the idea is that at that higher level, you'll have a system architect and a product management function and even a Scrum Master function called Release Train Engineer. And so the idea is that in some organic way that replicates at each level. And then what they call a large solution is that we have maybe a dozen teams that they all have to work together to create some huge functionality. And how do we split that up into what's going to happen in each team during each sprint? So if you are interested in how do multiple teams work together, this is one way to do it. I should just say one last comment on this. This may seem like an anti-Agile approach. I mean, if Agile is minimizes planning and coordination necessary, the kind of it's just kind of odd feature of this is that in order to do bigger things, you actually do have to put a lot more planning and coordination back into Agile, and that's what Scaled Agile is doing. Another way that I've seen Agile scaled is to only implement Agile in the detailed design phase. That is to do planning and concept development and even system level design where you do decomposition into the multiple teams to implement the architecture. Those upfront phases done in a more traditional way, small core team, maybe spend a year doing all that upfront work and then split it up into multiple teams doing all the detailed design, development, testing, and integration in parallel. And so this is something that I've seen work in well, in the aerospace industry and others where there's a need for a very careful upfront architecture phase. In software, I've seen it happen the other way around, where the architecture is more continuously developed. Maybe the third way that I've seen Agile scaled up is what the Scrum folks call Scrum at scale. And the idea is, and you can kind of see how things kind of replicate. The idea is we try to maintain the purity of the minimally structured teams. So if you look at the diagram on the top right, there's what's called a scrum of scrums. So if each team, which is in the small gray pentagons, has a scrum master and a product owner, well, then the scrum masters would all meet together into what's called the scrum of scrums. And here they're saying, how's it going on your team? And what process improvements can we take and share together? And in a similar way, the product owners meet together. So they call that the chief product owner has a meeting called a meta scrum. And so the idea is that each sides of this organization, the what and the how, have a way to kind of scale up. And then if that's at the level of, let's just say, a subsystem, you would have a system level one, which would be the next level up. And you'd have a chief product owner and a scrum of scrums. And maybe the terminology is a little bit weird, but the idea is that we try to kind of scale this up to replicate the typical system decomposition from system to subsystem to sub-assemblies and components. And the Scrum scaled process, or what's called Scrum at scale, replicates that. So those are some of the ways that Scrum has been, that Agile in general has been scaled up. And let me just wrap up by saying that I've been fascinated to watch how teams outside of software have been adapting this. So as they adopt it, as they use it, they have to adjust it. And I've been working with companies in a bunch of different industries from, well, you see here, from snack foods to aerospace, and it's just been fascinating. So I don't think I've seen any company implement this purely, meaning they swallow exactly the Scrum process or they implement exactly the SAFe process or whatever. Every time I've seen it adjusted. And I think that's been really interesting to see. Sure, it's not without challenges. There have been many, and that's what the adjustments are for.